Kevin McCullough.
Welcome back to Times Square. We're talking about, here on That Kevin Show, we're talking about persecution of people for their beliefs around the world. You may not think that that still happens. It happens in greater numbers now than it has ever happened in the past. And sadly, many of us in the West never hear about it at all because the press is not interested in telling these stories. But, you know, when the Olympics get together, you start to see names of countries that you may not have seen before. And one of the big surprises in the men's basketball division of the Olympics this year was South Sudan. And South Sudan is the youngest country on the planet, having only been formed after the Sudanese Civil War. But there's a story there. I welcome back Joel Veldkamp. What's going on there in South Sudan?
Yeah, in South Sudan, CSI is still working to liberate people who were enslaved during the Sudanese Civil War, specifically African Christians who were enslaved by jihadists sent by the North Sudanese government during the long civil war that lasted throughout the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s. At the time, hundreds of thousands of Christians were abducted and enslaved. And you know, when I say slavery, I mean slavery.
Right.
Sexual abuse, forced labor, forced conversion to Islam, almost always. The children that are born to people who are enslaved become enslaved themselves. So it's one of the world's worst slavery crises, I would say. And for many years, CSI has had an underground network that we support that tries to bring these people out of slavery from North Sudan back to their homeland in South Sudan. And just last month in June, another 300 people were freed through our network.
That's incredible to hear. And I know that my viewers and listeners played a large role in that. So I'm very, very grateful to hear that 300 more people have been liberated.
Absolutely. And one of these people was a 44-year-old man named Nial. And the Civil War ended 2003, 2004. So being 44 years old now, he was probably a young teenager when he was abducted. But like most people in his community, he was a cow farmer. And one day he was out with the cows and the slave raiders just descended on the cow camp and grabbed him and grabbed a lot of other people. And I'm not so shocked by what he said because this is quite common, that he told us that the slave raiders executed 2 of the enslaved people almost immediately, just to kind of strike terror into the rest of the group. And
send
make sure
a message, so to speak.
Yeah. To make sure they won't cause any problems on the long march into the north. So they killed 2 of the men with knives. They raped 3 of the women. And Nial said, I was crying and crying, and then they started beating me until I stopped crying. So that was his introduction into the world of slavery.
What was his life like day to day? And I'm a little bit surprised that he survived, because a lot of times they view the men, particularly the teenage boys, as a potential threat if they're not, converted to their way of thinking.
Yeah. And it is always a survival game in a way, that people have to find a way to convince their captors to keep them alive. So he was forcibly converted to Islam. He didn't want to, but he was forced by his master to adopt a Muslim name, to pray like a Muslim. He works 10 to 12 hours a day, every day. He was regularly beaten. His master would call him slave. That was like his term for Nial. So this is the kind of routine dehumanization that happens to Christians from South Sudan in this part of the world.
And what did he say when he got, as part of that liberation, when he got to safety? What was his response?
I think, like most people, he couldn't quite believe what had happened to him, but he was just so grateful to have been rescued, really. The slave retriever, who's part of our underground network, came to the village and found him and was able to negotiate a deal with the village chief in exchange for cattle vaccine. So Nial was allowed to go free, cross the border into what is now the independent country of South Sudan. And yeah, I think he's looking for his family now. We hope that he'll be able to find some relatives who are still alive. But no matter what, he's in a place where he can practice his Christian religion, where he can do what he wants to do for work, where he can have the relationships he chooses to have. It's a complete sea change in his life going forward.
I can only imagine that there's quite a bit of shock to the system, first when you're taken into slavery, but then the hesitancy to believe that the freedom could really be real on the back end of it, and to have the support of uh, the church and fellow Christians and people from the region. I know that you're not always able to place them exactly where they came from, but if you can get them plugged into a community, at least, of believers and sometimes former slaves, I know that that helps a great deal. Friends, again, if you want to know more about any of this, you can go to csi-usa.org.
Stick around for more of That Kevin. Next, That Kevin Show with Kevin McCullough.